Hey everyone, welcome back to the Photoshop Training Hour. I am your host, Jesus Ramirez. How's it going? Before we start, I would like to thank our sponsors, MSI. Actually, no, MSI is not on this side. They're on this side. I would like to thank our sponsors, MSI, for sponsoring today's episode of the Photoshop Training Hour. I hope that you're doing well. I'm streaming from the beautiful San Francisco Bay Area in California. Let me know where you're streaming from. I always love to see where everybody is watching from. In this episode of the Photoshop Training Hour, I'm going to show you some of my favorite Lightroom tips and tricks that I hope that you don't know, and I hope that they help you become better at using Lightroom and creating beautiful images in Lightroom. So we're not going to work in Photoshop today. We'll be in Lightroom, but I think that you will learn a lot. I can see a lot of people in the chat saying hello. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate all the support. Before we start, I do want to mention one other thing, something very important. In October, I will be teaching at Adobe Max. Adobe Max is a free conference from Adobe, and you can go into max.adobe.com and you can see the list of speakers. I am one of the speakers speaking at this conference, and I am teaching 2 sessions: Essential Editing Techniques for Creating Realistic Composites and Photoshop Advanced Techniques. These sessions are free, so you can sign up and watch them for free on October 27th and 28th of this year. The link to the sessions is in the description, so you can just click over into the Adobe Max website, sign up for free, and check out my 2 free sessions at Adobe Max. So make sure that you do that. I just wanted to point that out before we got started with today's stream. So like I said, today we're going to work with Lightroom, and I'm going to show you some of my favorite Lightroom tips and tricks. I'm going to work with Lightroom, not Lightroom Classic. So Lightroom, what was formerly known as Lightroom CC, is a cloud-based version of Lightroom. There's also another version of Lightroom, Lightroom Classic, which is the version that is not necessarily cloud-based. You can still upload your smart previews and images to the cloud if you want to, but it's based mainly in your computer. So I will be using Lightroom, formerly known as Lightroom CC, in this stream. Why don't we jump right into it? I am using the latest version of Lightroom, and I just want to show you a couple of things that you might not know, and hopefully they can benefit you in your creative process. So the first thing I want to show you in Lightroom is, as I mentioned earlier, this version of Lightroom is based on the cloud, but if you want to, you can actually have the images also stored in your hard drive. And the way that you would do that is by going into the edit menu and going into the preferences option. And from here, make sure that under local storage, you enable the store a copy of all originals at the specified location. If you enable this checkbox, you will store a copy of the original images in your computer if you want to. I don't necessarily like doing that, but I do like mentioning that option in case you do want to have a copy of the original in your machine, and just click on done whenever you have completed that task. So that is one way of saving a copy of your images into your machine. And yeah, so I just wanted to mention that quick preference before we got started. Let's just jump right into one of these images. You probably have seen this image before. I've used it many times on different tutorials, but it's a great image to show you a lot of features in Lightroom. So in Lightroom, you can click on this icon here to open up the Edit panel. The Edit panel has all these different panels inside of it that have options that will allow you to edit the image. One of the options is the Auto button. When you click on the Auto button, Lightroom will use artificial intelligence, Adobe Sensei, to analyze the image and make adjustments on the sliders to try to create the most beautiful and pleasing image. And as you can see, it adjusted the exposure, contrast, light, shadows, whites, blacks, and in some cases, it will also adjust the vibrance and saturation as well as the color balance. So it's a fantastic button to get you started with. If you don't really know what adjustment to make, you can just click on this Auto button to get started. Notice that once I click on the Auto button again, it undoes that effect. Now, maybe you're someone who does know a little more about how to use these sliders and you can start adjusting them on your own, but then you might get stuck with a slider and you don't necessarily know what to do. You don't have to darken or brighten the shadows. So what you can do is you can hold the Shift key on the keyboard. The Shift key is the same as both Windows and Macs. And notice that when I hold the Shift key, the sliders now have an auto button next to the name. See that? When I hold Shift. So what this allows you to do is to apply that same automatic adjustment, but to that single slider. So when I click on shadows while holding the Shift key, double click, Photoshop will automatically apply the same auto adjustment that the auto button applied, but only to that slider. So you can apply the auto adjustment globally by hitting the auto button, or you can simply select one of the sliders and double click to apply the auto adjustment. So globally or on a single slider or a combination of sliders, totally up to you. Let me know in the chat if you knew these techniques already. Karan is asking in the chat, can we use these tricks in Lightroom Classic as well? This particular trick should also work in Lightroom Classic. In fact, most of the things I'm going to show today will also work in Lightroom Classic, except for the store locally preferences option. I don't think that one's in Lightroom Classic. If it is, someone let me know in the chat, but I don't believe that it is. But most of the things that I'm going to show will also work in Classic using the same keyboard combination in most cases. So very good question, Karan. Thank you for asking. Cool. Oh, did I say Photoshop, Jim? I meant to say Lightroom. I'm so used to saying Photoshop when I'm talking about, editing images. But to be fair, the official name for Lightroom is Adobe Photoshop Lightroom. So there's still Photoshop in the name. But yeah, you're right. I misspoke. I didn't even realize when I said Photoshop. Cool. Hard on brand it is. I'm not really sure what you mean. Maybe you're talking about the sweater. I am wearing an Adobe Max sweater, which is the conference that I was just speaking about earlier. Or maybe, I don't know. I don't know what else you're referring to. Cool. Let's move on to the next tip. So you probably know the healing brush tool. The healing brush tool is a tool that allows you to paint over the image, and Photoshop automatically selects an area to sample from. So if I zoom in to say 400 and use the space bar and click and drag, you'll be able to see what's going on, right? If you can click and drag and move the sample source into position, and you can see that there's this little tiny white line with an arrow pointing to this bottom part. So this basically means that I'm removing the contents of this area by using the source pixels on this area on the left. So basically I take the stuff on the left and put it over on the stuff on the right, and I can either heal it, which blends the pixels together, or clone them, which is basically copying. You copy and paste essentially, right? So that is super cool. And as you just saw, you can click and drag to a different location to generate a better result if you want. Now, the keyboard shortcut that most people don't know is that you can let Lightroom automatically select a different sample source by just tapping one key, and that's what I'm doing right now. I'm tapping on the / key. That's the same key as the question mark in North American keyboards, and you can see that Lightroom is attempting to find better pixels. In this case, it's going to do a good job because I'm trying to remove a piece of the sky and everything else looks the same. But maybe if I'm trying to remove the boat, let's try that. If I'm trying to remove the boat, you can see the result there. It still did a good job, but if I'm unhappy with that, I can tap on the / key. That's the question mark, and you can see how Lightroom is trying to find a better spot for that heal. Again, it does a fantastic job that I didn't need to do that. But in case that your image needs a better sample source and you can't see one yourself, you can just tap on that / key. Again, that's the question mark key in North American keyboards, and Lightroom will automatically find a sample source. Cool. Thank you so much, Pasindu. He's saying, hey, love your show and keep it up. Love from Sri Lanka. Thank you so much. Cool. Yeah, so just keep tapping on that / key, same key as a question mark, in North American keyboards to find a new sample source when you are working with the healing brush tool. In some cases, you may need to check the visualize spots checkbox here on the right. You can see that right here. That box helps you look at things like dust particles and things like that were on the lens, and you can visualize them better and maybe remove them. I think I see one here. You can see that I can just click over that spot and it removes it. You just want to make sure that there's no spots that will be visible when you're printing your images. But you can disable this option when you're done and see the spot is no longer there. Cool. We have hey Andrew from Poland and Fahim from Bangladesh. How's it going? Thank you so much for watching. This next one is a pretty cool one, but before we go any further, let me just make this image look a little nicer. I'm just gonna increase the exposure, reduce the highlights to get more detail in the sky, and bring in the shadows. Then I'll go into the color panel and I'll increase vibrance. Vibrance is a smarter way of adding saturation. It protects already saturated pixels and skin tones. There's no real skin tones here, but that's okay. So with the local adjustments, I can go into the gradient here and I can click and drag to create a linear gradient. And what I want to do is affect the water. And I can come in here and maybe move the temperature over to the left to make the water a little bluer, move it away from green, and adjust it accordingly. And for the purposes of this example, I know this is not going to look great, but that's okay. For the purposes of this example, I'm going to increase the texture and the clarity and, make that water really, really pop, maybe even some dehaze, maybe even brighten it up a little bit, make all these different adjustments, right? And that's what this is doing. Now, this is a trick that most people don't know. And as you're hovering over this dot, you see this dot here that controls the gradient? When you hover over this dot and you hold the Alt key on Windows, that's the Option key on the Mac, you'll get this double-sided arrow. See this double-sided white arrow? Well, I can now click and drag. And when I click and drag, I want you to pay attention to the panel on the right. You'll notice in the panel on the right that certain sliders were moved all the way to the extreme, like the texture to 100, and then others not so much, like maybe the haze at 13, and then we have some in the negative values as well, like temperature. I want you to notice those as I hold Alt on Windows, Option on the Mac. I'll click and drag. See how I'm reducing the intensity of that effect? See that? So you can think of this as an opacity slider. If I drag to the left, I reduce the intensity proportionately of those effects. See that? Once I get here, they're all basically at 0. And if I go to the right, I start increasing that effect. So with any of the local adjustment controls, including the radial control and the brush tool, I can make my adjustments, then hold Alt on Windows, Option on the Mac, hover over this blue dot and click and drag to the left or to the right to make those adjustments here. You can see in the panel here on the side how those adjustments are adjusted proportionally. So it's a fantastic, fantastic tool. If you can't see the dot, if you're trying to work on this and you can't see the dot, make sure that you tap on the O key on the keyboard to show the mask overlays. See that? See how I'm tapping on the O key, the different overlays appear and disappear? So make sure that you have the blue dot. Make your adjustments, and here I'll just make an extreme adjustment so that you can see. Obviously this is going to look terrible, but you will be able to see when in the slider how this works. See that? If I hold Alt on Windows, Option on the Mac, and click and drag, you'll be able to see how I can control all those sliders accordingly. So it's like you can think of it as an opacity slider, if you will. Let me know in the chat if you knew that trick, and if you liked it, why not hit on that like button as you're watching the video. Let me see if there's any questions in the chat. Yeah, we have a lot of people watching from Poland, Bangladesh, Canada. Good to see you in the chat. Bob, this may be the current version. I don't know if there was a previous question about what version we're on, but this is the latest version of Lightroom. I'm not really sure the version number, but if you go into help And there should be an about option here. About Lightroom, you'll see that I'm working on version 4.4, 4.4 of Photoshop Lightroom. This is the cloud-based version of Lightroom, not Lightroom Classic. But again, a lot of these keyboard shortcuts work the same in Lightroom Classic. Cool. Cornell is saying in the chat that he didn't know that trick. I'm glad that you are enjoying it. Cool. Awesome. We got Goddess Playground, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced that second name, last name, or handle there. You're from the Bay Area. I'm from the Bay Area in California as well. As I said, I'm streaming from San Ramon, California, in the San Francisco Bay Area. Cool. We got Mateus from Brazil. Good to see you, Mateus. Now let's continue working on this image. I'm not necessarily happy with this adjustment here. I don't think it looks great, but I just wanted to make something extreme so that it was noticeable. But you know, don't judge me so much on the way this photo looks at the moment. Cool. Another thing that I wanted to talk about was when making a global adjustment here on the edit panel. If you are going here into the detail panel, you can increase the sharpness of an image, right? But you really can't see what you're doing. But Lightroom, I want to keep saying Photoshop now that I think it was Jim who called me on it earlier. I keep saying Photoshop when I mean to say Lightroom. But when you're working in Lightroom, you'll notice that the sharpening slider has this red overlay to the right of it. That's just to let you know that you never really want to get into the red. In most cases, going to the red could get you into trouble. So make sure that you stay away from the red. Also, make sure that you click on this down pointing arrow to see the controls that help you sharpen your image. And one of the important ones is the masking slider. If you drag the masking slider, you really can't see what's going on, but there's a lot going on. And to really see what this effect is doing, you can hold the Alt key on Windows. That's the Option key on the Mac, and click. And when you start at 0, the masking at 0, you will see a completely white screen. This is just like a layer mask in Photoshop. White reveals, black conceals. And as you drag to the right, you can see that areas of the image start getting darker and eventually they become black. Anything that is black will not have the sharpening effect applied to it. So what Photoshop or Lightroom is doing here is finding the edges of your image the further you go to the right. So that way you only apply the sharpening effect to the edges, because, for example, if I just leave it set to 0, I really don't want to apply any sharpening to the clouds. I don't need it, but I do need some sharpening on the bird, the bridge, maybe even the water. So you can make that adjustment so that you can target which edges to apply the sharpening effect to. So in this case, maybe somewhere right about here, and I can adjust my sharpening accordingly. Also, as you drag the sharpening slider, make sure that you are holding the Alt key on Windows, that's the Option key on the Mac, so that you remove the color from the image temporarily. Removing the color or desaturating the image makes it easier for you to see what is actually happening on that image in terms of adding contrast to edge pixels. That's another thing I should mention. When you're applying a sharpening to an image, whether it's in Lightroom, Photoshop, or any other image application, you're not really creating more detail. You're creating the illusion that there is more detail by adding contrast to edge pixels. And that could be difficult to see if you have the color enabled, but when you hold Alt and Windows Option in the Mac and you drag, you can see that effect even better. And actually, I'll zoom in even further so you see exactly what I'm talking about. You see, I'll go into 1600. Alt and Windows Option on the Mac. Look at the edge pixels there. See that? See how I'm making the bottom of the bridge here, this edge, much brighter and the one on top much darker? That's really what sharpening is. You're adding that contrast on edge pixels to create the illusion that there's more detail. But also, this helps you see another issue. When you increase the sharpening, you also start introducing more noise to your image. So this is exactly why this tool could be beneficial, because you can just make sure that you don't add that much noise to these pixels here in the bottom, just to pixels that require it, like you see there. And obviously you can start adjusting the radius. Notice that if I increase the radius, those edge pixels become thicker, much wider. See that? See the edges there on the bottom of the bridge? So you can also adjust the thickness, if you will, of those edge pixels and that contrast that you create and you can just use the detail slider again to fine tune more of that sharpening. So sharpening is not as simple as dragging a slider. Sometimes you do need to come in and make more adjustments to these other sliders. So if I set the masking to 0, you'll notice that I'm sharpening a lot of the sky and a lot of those other pixels that really shouldn't be sharpened. And if I increase the masking slider all the way to the right, you can see that I'm masking less of the sky and more of the edge pixels, which is what you want to do in most cases. So one of the questions in the well, there's a couple questions here that I want to answer. Which is better to use, Lightroom or Photoshop? Well, it depends, right? It depends on what you're doing. If all you're doing is making tonal corrections to an image, raw photo, for example, then Lightroom could be just fine, but Lightroom can't do layers, text, and other things like that like Photoshop can. So then you would have to use Photoshop for that. So the better one to use is the one that better serves your needs. There's no really better, there's no such thing as better. Now, I will say that anything that Lightroom can do in terms of editing the image, Photoshop can do as well. Lightroom has other features that are not necessarily about editing images that Photoshop can do, but in terms of editing a photo, Photoshop can do everything that Lightroom can. But that doesn't mean that Photoshop is better. It just means that it has more tools, which can make it a little more complicated. But if you're starting out and you just want to make tonal and color adjustments to your photo, a couple perspective adjustments to your photos, then Lightroom is perfectly capable and more than good enough to handle that. In fact, it's probably better than Photoshop, since it has less options and probably easier to use for a beginner. But not necessarily better in terms of the results that you get. Cool. Let me see. I saw another question here that I wanted to answer. Okay, so what are my thoughts on using Lightroom on the iPad Pro? The same as my thoughts on using the Lightroom on my mobile device. So I actually use Lightroom a lot on my mobile device, and I think it's great. Most of the controls are there, so it's a great way of working on the go. Excuse me. Anything that you do on any one of these, if you do something on Lightroom mobile, Lightroom desktop, or Lightroom for the web, they all sync. So you can start working on your mobile device, continue working on the desktop if you want. And something that I should mention is that, let me open up a window so I can show you, is that if you go into lightroom.adobe.com, and let me make sure that's the actual page. Yeah, if you go into lightroom.adobe.com, you'll go to this website, and you obviously have to be signed into your Creative Cloud account. But basically, these are all the images that I'm just working on my Lightroom. See, tips and tricks class right now, same thing. I can come in here and I can make an adjustment on the web version. This is a browser. This is not Lightroom. I'm using Google Chrome, and I can come in here and make an adjustment using basically the same controls. They're not all here, but most of them are here. So I could come in here and, do a color balance adjustment to the image. There you go. It looks fantastic. I could close it, and this will save onto the Creative Cloud. And imagine that I'm not sitting here on my computer. Imagine that I'm at a friend's house and that I just wanted to make a quick edit on the browser. They don't have Lightroom. I can do that. And then when I, go home eventually, that same adjustment will be applied to the image inside of Lightroom. It's not happening on the go. I'm not sure if it didn't have time to update, but it should update. Maybe I closed it too soon, but it should update immediately on my version of Lightroom here on the, there you go, on the desktop. See, it took a second, but there it is. It took a second, it took about a minute, but as you can see, I made my adjustments on the web, and then they get sent everywhere else. They synchronize on my desktop and whatever mobile device I have. So that was a really long way of answering the question. I think that editing on the iPad is great. It has a lot of the same features, just like the mobile version on my phone and the web version online. And everything syncs, so no matter where you work, you can continue working anywhere else. There's a question about resetting sliders, so let me go back into that. So when you're working in let me use the image I was using before because I think that one will better represent this question. So if I'm editing my image, you'll notice a couple of things. Notice next to the toolbar here that there's these dots on the right. These dots indicate that I've made a change in that particular tool. So I've made changes in the edit panel, obviously. And not only that, the panels where I made a change also have an eye icon. If I didn't make a change in that panel, there's no eye icon. What the eye icon allows you to do is to see the image without the effects in that panel. See that? And if I wanted to reset a particular panel, maybe I don't want the changes in the light panel, all I need to do is hold the Alt key on Windows, that's the Option key on the Mac, and click on Reset Light, and I will reset the sliders in that panel. Notice that the eye icon went away because there's no longer any adjustments in that panel. So again, the eye icon allows you to temporarily hide the adjustments in that panel. If you want to reset the adjustments in the panel, hold Alt on Windows, Option on the Mac, and click on the Reset label. If you want to reset everything, you want to get rid of everything, you can go into the 3-dot icon and select Reset Edits, or you can press the keyboard shortcut Shift-R. So I can reset the edits and all the edits go away. I'm using Control Z on Windows, that's Command Z on the Mac to undo. Cool. So let me work on one other thing here. You can see this bird and I'm zooming way too much. So let me just do maybe like a 300. I think 300 should work. So when you zoom in on this bird, and by the way, when you're in Lightroom, you can just hit the spacebar and you zoom into where you were before. So you can work on something, hit the spacebar, zoom out to see it, hit the spacebar again, you zoom back in. So you might notice these green and magenta outlines. This is Chromatic Aberration. And you can get rid of Chromatic Aberration by going into the Optics panel. And usually this is what it looks like by default. And what you need to do is just simply hit on Remove Chromatic Aberration, and Lightroom will do a decent job of removing those highlights. But if you notice, there's still a magenta tint on there. So let me zoom in even closer to maybe 400%. Maybe we'll go more. We'll go 800. And you can sort of see the magenta there on the wing steel. So if you see that the fringing or the chromatic aberration is not going away, click on the fringe, open that up, and you can just select the color that you want to try to remove, the magenta or the green, and just increase the amount. See that? See that by increasing the amount, that magenta goes away. So just adjust it accordingly up until the point that the magenta goes away. So this is before and this is after. So completely removes the chromatic aberration. If you had a green tint, then obviously you would click on this green dot and make that adjustment. And notice a little dot, this tiny little dot underneath the larger circle, that just indicates that you made an adjustment to that particular control. So this is a good way of visualize what you change in the image if you forgot. Cool. Let me see what we have next and on my notes here. You probably have seen the Haze slider. The Haze just allows you to remove haze in an image. And I'm actually going to brighten this up just to make it easier to see. So you can click and drag on this slider to remove haze from an image. But if you want to get creative, you can actually drag the slider to the left and introduce haze to the image. So now I have a hazy day, and obviously I would need to control the exposure, maybe reduce it and make different adjustments so that it looks more realistic. But you can either remove haze or add haze with the dehaze slider. So dragging the slider to the right removes haze, dragging the slider to the left creates the illusion of haze. Cool. You probably have seen, let me see, I might have a better image to show this next part. Yeah, this image probably will work fine. I can come in here, open this up, and again, I'll just hit auto button just to automatically make color adjustments, go into the color panel, and I can increase the vibrance to add more saturation selectively. The saturation slider increases the saturation of all pixels equally, but the vibrance, again, is a smarter way of adding saturation. It protects highly saturated pixels and skin tones. And you probably have seen the color mixer before, but I really, really like the color mixer. With the color mixer, I have the option of selecting one of the colors here, whichever one I want, and then adjust the hue, saturation, and luminance. If you don't see this, that might be because you have one of these other options enabled. Maybe you have hue selected, and if you have hue selected, then you'll see red, orange, and then the list of the colors here. I prefer having the color option selected so that I can pick a color and then adjust the component rather than selecting the component and adjusting the color. So what I mean by that is, if I select saturation, that's a component, I have a list of all the colors here and I can adjust the saturation of all those colors. I prefer selecting a color and then having the 3 components for that color listed on there. The result's the same. It doesn't really change anything in terms of how the tool operates. It just changes how you visualize it as you're working. I prefer to visualize it this way. And what you can do is you can select the oranges and increase the saturation of just the oranges. Maybe adjust the hue and shift it to another hue if you want. You can do the same thing with the blues. Maybe increase the saturation of the blues, darken them up a little bit, adjust the shift the hues, whatever you want to do. So this is why I really like the color mixer. It really allows you to target colors in an image and make adjustments to the hue, which is the color. Like what you can shift the hue, in this case the blue, we can make it more purple or more cyan. Totally up to you what you want to do. Double clicking on the slider resets the slider, by the way. And the other thing that you can do is you can click on this icon, the target adjustment icon, and you can just click directly over a color. You can see that as I hover over a color, Lightroom tells me what it is. See that? And I can just click and then drag left or right. See that for hue? Super, super cool. It's a fantastic way of controlling the image. So once you select the color here, you can just go left and right to make an adjustment. But yeah, click and drag and it's making those adjustments. Also, the reason that I'm selecting the hue when I'm using the targeted selection tool, like what if I wanted to use saturation rather than hue? Because right now when I click and drag, I'm adjusting the hue. Or what if I wanted to adjust saturation? Well, just click on saturation here. And when you click and drag, you will adjust the saturation. And I can click on luminance. And when I click and drag, I will control the luminance of those colors. So make sure that you pay attention to the controls here on the bottom and select the appropriate one for the result that you want. Leatherface is asking, can the dehaze be controlled for only certain areas? So yeah, let me go back into the haze and just answer the haze question. So yeah, the way that you would do that is by creating a targeted adjustment, whatever it is. I made a radial earlier, but you can use the brush tool if you want, and you can just paint on the areas that you want to adjust. And then you can go into the dehaze and adjust the dehaze accordingly. See that? See how now I'm adjusting dehaze only in the areas where I painted? So that's how you would control or target the dehaze onto a specific area. But let me go back into the image we're working with to continue talking about color. So what we can do now is, from this panel, we made those adjustments, and as you can see, we can selectively target the colors, control one of the 3 components, hue, saturation, or luminance, by using the targeted adjustment or by simply selecting one of the colors in this option and moving the sliders around accordingly. Another thing that you can do is go up here in the edit panel, right above everything else, right above or right next to the auto button, you'll see a B and W button. When you click on that, the image will become black and white. And notice what happens to the color mixer. It now becomes the black and white mixer. And what that allows you to do is simply select the color and make it brighter or darker. And what this is doing is just controlling the original color. So what was red before, I can now make darker or brighter. See that? So this gives you complete control of your black and white images. You can get some really cool effects based on how you adjust these sliders. So maybe I can decide to make the greens really bright or really dark, whatever works better for you. See, I can make these adjustments here, and I'm just sort of eyeballing it here just to get a good result. But this is completely subjective, whatever looks good to your eye. And I think something like that may work. So this is without making the adjustments, and this is by making the adjustments. See how I can completely change the look of a black and white image just by controlling the black and white mixer? I think it's a powerful control, and I highly recommend that you try it out. Before we continue, I would like to take a quick break and talk a little bit about today's sponsor. As I said before, MSI Computers is sponsoring today's video, and let me just bring this back to the front here. And I am currently using the MSI Creator Z16 laptop. I'm not using it at this moment. This is a laptop that I'm using, generally speaking. And as the Creator Z16 is a fantastic laptop that I highly recommend. If you saw my most recent video on making backgrounds white, I highly recommend that you watch it. But in that video, I talk about the laptop, and one of the great things about this laptop is the powerful 11th Gen Core i9 processor that delivers up to 4.9 gigahertz of dual core turbo frequency. Fantastic for creating on the go. It's great for creative professionals. It's got a GeForce RTX 30 series GPU, which is great for editing up to 8K HDR raw video and working with large 3D models. It has a 4K display. Talking about the display, it has a touchscreen that you can just use your finger and touch and tap on different things. But the coolest thing about this screen is that it uses the 10:16 aspect ratio. And as you can see from the animation, that just allows you to see more of the panels in Photoshop and other Adobe applications as you're working. So I highly recommend that you check that out. So yeah, this is the laptop that I'm currently using, the Creator Z16. The device that I'm using to stream this event is the Aegis Ti5. It's a really powerful computer that I highly, highly recommend. It's a beast. It's completely, it's a gaming computer, but it's still fantastic for doing your creative work since it has a lot of power. And the monitor here to my right, where I'm reading your comments, is the Creator PS321 series. It's a 4K monitor. Again, fantastic for creatives. And it has a lot of awesome features that I think most creatives would enjoy. The color representation on this is fantastic. So I highly recommend that you check out all these products by MSI. They are the sponsors of the Photoshop Training Hour. So thank you so much, MSI, for sponsoring these live streams. If you're interested on any of these products, including the Creator Z16 laptop, make sure that you look below in the description and you can just click on the links and check these products out. So thank you so much, MSI, for sponsoring today's stream. And actually, you know what? Now that we took a little break, something else I want to mention. Look below in the description for my LinkedIn profile. If you want to follow me on LinkedIn, make sure that you click on my LinkedIn profile in the description and follow me there if you like. So yeah, if you're a LinkedIn user, I would love to follow you on there. Cool. Or connect. I think the right term is connect. We got Robert from Brooklyn, New York. How's it going, Robert? I was just in Brooklyn approximately 2 months ago. Nice. Let's now work on another image, and I guess we'll work on this image. Why not? One of the things that the brush tool allows you to do, as you saw a moment ago, is to paint over an image. And if you can't see what you're painting, press on the O key and you can see what you're painting. And by default, you can just paint as you would any other image, right? But if you wanted to paint to maybe affect just his jacket, it might be a little difficult to stay within the lines. So something that you can do in Lightroom is enable the auto mask option, and you can paint. And notice how I'm staying within the lines. The reason that I'm actually painting outside of the line over here and in the shadows is because the color of the shadow is the same color as the jacket. But notice that it didn't affect the white areas. So this is great to paint and make sure that you stay inside the line. So in this case, what I could do here on the right is go into the eraser tool and just erase these areas here that I accidentally painted on. And now that I've made that selection, what I can do is go into, press the O key on the keyboard to hide the overlay. And I can just increase the texture, adjust the shadows, and just make adjustments to the jacket. Another thing that you can do is shift the hue, increase the saturation. See that? Or you can even colorize it. So I can reset the hue and then just enable the colorization option here and then just pick a color. So maybe I can make the jacket brown or blue or whatever color I want. See that? Super, super cool. And of course, you can continue adjusting the other sliders to make that jacket look much, much cooler. Whatever you want to do. You have total control. The point is that the auto mask feature allows you to paint within the lines in Lightroom. And in some cases, if the color that you're painting on is also found on other areas outside of the image, like in this case, the shadows, then you can select the eraser tool and erase the pixels that shouldn't be selected. And you can then make any adjustments that you want to that selected color. Cool. Let me see if there's any other questions in the chat. Awesome. Yeah, so this is one thing that you can do. Let me reset this image. Again, you can go into the 3-dot icon to reset an image, or you can press Shift R on both Windows and PC. And something else that I wanted to talk about is the awesome tool that Lightroom has here in the edit panel to color grade. So the color grading tool here, it's fantastic. It used to be the dual tone controls in Lightroom, and I think a version or two ago they added the color grading tool, which basically added an extra midtones circle control. Before, you can just adjust the shadows and highlights, and now we can control the midtones. And what this allows us to do is to apply a color to the shadows, midtones, and highlights. You can do it by using these controls. I like using the single ones better. So shadows, midtones, and highlights. And I mean, just for the purposes of this example, I'm going to make the shadows blue, and I can click and drag these this circle to adjust it, or even better, by clicking on these arrows, you have control of the saturation, the luminance, and the hue, which is the color. So I can select blue, make it a little bit brighter, maybe more in the blues, like right here. Then I can go into the midtones, and in the midtones, I'm going to select green just so that we can see something different. Green in the midtones. And I know this is going to look terrible, but you'll get the idea. So midtones are there, just this green, and then I can go into the highlights. In the highlights, I'll make red. So notice how I was able to apply 3 colors to this image. Blue to the shadows, green to the midtones, and red to the highlights. Like I said, it looks terrible, but it is what it is. And you can see here in this gradient how the colors are affected. See the blues here in the shadows, the greens in the midtones, and the reds in the highlights. And the cool thing is that you can use this bending slider to control how, blending, excuse me, not bending, to control how those pixels blend. And you can see that in the gradient here. You can see the balance. The balance basically tells Photoshop what a highlight is. So the more you drag to the left, the fewer the pixels that are considered highlights will be. And the more you drag to the right, the more that the pixels that are, the more pixels are considered highlights. So see that? See how I'm just increasing the highlights? So now all these pixels are considered highlights. So you can adjust that accordingly. And that's why I have this gradient down here, so you can see how these controls affect the image. See that? See how I'm now making more pixels green? And I can go into the shadows and basically do the same thing. Now more pixels are considered shadows. So totally up to you how you control these adjustments to get something that looks good. Now the cool thing about all this is that there's also this global adjustment. And what the global adjustment allows you to do is to apply another color on top of everything else. So I'm not overriding the previous colors. I'm only adding a 4th color. So I can come in here and select magenta and reduce the saturation a little bit, but you can see how now I'm adding magenta on top of everything else. So you can get really crazy and really creative with the color grading. To be frank with you, in most cases, I'm holding Alt and Window, Option on the Mac, by the way, to reset. In most cases, what I like to do is I like to select just the shadows, select the color, like in this case, maybe a blue-ish color, and then adjust the luminance a little bit, and then go into the midtones, maybe add a little bit of blue as well, maybe make the midtones darker. I added a little bit of, I made some adjustments there to his face, so maybe I can come in and just paint using the not the auto mask mode, I'm sorry, just the regular mask here. And I'm going quickly here, obviously, but I want to remove some of the blue that I added onto his face and things like that. So what I'm going to do is, after I have his face selected, I can come in here and maybe add a little bit of yellow. I'll have to tap on the O key to disable the overlay so I can see. And I can add a little bit of yellow and magenta just to bring his skin tones back. And so that the skin tones look much more realistic, but I still keep that color grade that I applied to the image. See that? Before and after. And by the way, if you want to use a keyboard shortcut to see the before and after, you can tap on the backslash key on the keyboard. Those are the same keys as the bracket keys on a keyboard, same row as the letter P, to the right of the letter P in North American keyboards. Cool. Let me see if there's any other questions. I already talked about sharpening earlier. I don't know if you missed it, Leatherface, but I spoke about sharpening a little earlier. Is this a new update? Brianna, everything I've shown isn't necessarily new. Everything that I've shown has been around for at least one version, maybe longer. Cool. And we only have a few more minutes, so let me just think of what I can show. Oh, you know what? Something that I haven't talked about that I really like. So this will be the last thing I show. You have to get going, but I think you'll like this last tip. So if you go into the menu here, there's an option called Geometry. And if you click on this upright option, you can select Auto, and Photoshop will automatically try to straighten the edges in your image. So you can see the before and the after. See that? You can also do it manually by clicking on the guided uprights, and what you can do is just click over your image and drag these sliders so that you tell Photoshop that these sliders should be straight, or these these lines should be straight. And I can do the same thing from the top part here, and maybe I can do the same thing here, just looking for these straight edges, like so. As you can see, we have straightened the image. And then I can scale it in a little bit to remove the white, and I can offset it up or down. Offset simply means move left or right, whatever you think works best for you, and maybe even scale it a bit more so that I have more room to work with, something like that. So now I'm looking, it looks like I shot this photo straight on rather than just having it at an angle. So I really, really like the guided option here, the geometry option. It really helps your images look a little bit more professional instead of having that weird angle, especially if you shot it with a phone. This was shot with my Google Pixel, and I was at an angle, obviously, looking up, and it doesn't look as good as if I would have shot it straight on. So this is a fantastic technique that you can use to straighten your images. Just want to remind everybody about my Adobe Max session, which is essential editing techniques for creating realistic composites and Photoshop advanced techniques. And these are free classes at Adobe Max. You can go into .adobemax.com to sign up for these classes. There's a link to it below in the description. So make sure that you check out these free classes. You can watch them on Wednesday, October 27th and Thursday, October 28th. So make sure that you sign up, you watch live, and I'll be there answering questions. So free sessions at Adobe Max. Also, if you want to, make sure that you follow me on LinkedIn. The link to my LinkedIn profile is in the description. And of course, thank you so much to our sponsors at MSI for sponsoring today's video. It was a pleasure having everyone here with me on the stream. I look forward to seeing you next time. Don't forget to check out all the new videos on the Photoshop training channel. I published so many new videos in the last couple of weeks, including my in-app Photoshop tutorials. I highly recommend that you watch those. Just head on over to my YouTube channel. You're there already if you're watching this. and check out all the new videos. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I will talk to you again next time. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day. Bye.